All right, folks, Bob here. And today I want to talk about something that stresses out Americans and confuses everyone else. Tipping. Now, I'm 70 years old. I've been tipping my whole life. I've seen how it's changed dramatically over the decades. And I've got to tell you, it's gotten completely out of control. When I was young, back in the 50s and 60s, tipping was simple. You went to a restaurant, you tipped your server 15% if the service was good, 10% if it was just okay, 20% if the service was exceptional, and you really wanted to show appreciation. That was it. Simple. Everyone knew the rules. Now? Now it's 20% minimum, and people are pushing for 25 or even 30%. And it's not just restaurants anymore. It's everywhere. Coffee shops, food trucks, takeout counters where the person just handed you a bag. There's a tip screen asking for 25%. You're standing there at the counter feeling guilty while the worker watches you decide how much to tip for literally handing you something. Bakeries, ice cream shops, even self-serve places where you do everything yourself. The payment terminal still asks for a tip. So let me explain how we got here, because this didn't come out of nowhere. There's a long, complicated, and honestly pretty dark history to tipping in America. Let's go back to the beginning. Tipping actually started in Europe. Wealthy Americans traveling abroad in the late 1800s learned about the practice and brought it back as a way to seem sophisticated and worldly. But here's where it gets dark. After the Civil War, when slavery was abolished, restaurants and hotels needed workers. They hired formerly enslaved black people as servers, waiters, porters, and other service positions. But they didn't want to pay them fair wages, so they used tipping as an excuse. They'd say, "You work for tips. We don't have to pay you much of anything." It was exploitation from the very start, a way to avoid paying fair wages to people who had just been freed from slavery. There was actually a movement in the early 1900s to ban tipping. People saw it as un-American, anti-democratic. The idea that some people served others for tips seemed to go against American values of equality. Several states even passed laws banning tipping, but the laws didn't stick. The practice was too ingrained, and the restaurant industry fought hard to keep it. Then came the Great Depression in the 1930s. Times were incredibly hard. Restaurants were struggling. They went to the government and lobbied for a special exemption. They said, "Look, our servers get tips. Let us pay them less than minimum wage since they're making money from tips." The government, trying to help businesses survive, agreed. And that system is still in place today. Right now, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, but the federal tipped minimum wage is $2.13 an hour. Think about that. $2.13. That hasn't changed since 1991. Over 30 years with no increase. Now, some states have higher minimums. California, for example, pays the full minimum wage to everyone, including tipped workers. Same with Washington, Oregon, a few others. But in a lot of states, especially in the South and Midwest, servers make $2 or $3 an hour base pay. They live almost entirely on tips. Technically, according to federal law, if a server's tips don't bring them up to regular minimum wage, the employer has to make up the difference. In practice, this rarely happens. Employers often ignore this rule, and workers don't complain because they're afraid of losing their jobs. And even when it does happen, minimum wage itself isn't enough to live on anyway. $7.25 an hour, working full-time, that's about $15,000 a year before taxes. You can't live on that. So servers depend on tips for survival. That's not optional. That's not extra money. That's their rent, their groceries, their ability to keep the lights on. Now here's where it gets complicated, because there are multiple perspectives here, and honestly, everyone has valid points. From the customer perspective, and I hear this all the time, people are frustrated. They say, "Why am I paying the employees' wages?" That's the employer's job. The price on the menu should be the actual price, not some starting point where I'm expected to add 20 or 30%. I shouldn't have to do mental math every time I eat out. I shouldn't have to guess what's appropriate, and I especially shouldn't feel guilty when I'm just picking up takeout and there's still a tip line staring at me. Plus, customers point out, we're already paying for the food. We're already supporting the business. Why is it our responsibility to make sure workers earn a living wage? That feels backwards. And they're not wrong. That is backwards. From the server perspective, and I've talked to plenty of them, including my granddaughter who waited tables through college, the situation is more nuanced than you might think. Many servers actually prefer the tipping system. On a good night, at a busy restaurant, they can make $25 or $30 an hour, sometimes more. If restaurants switched to paying hourly wages, they'd probably make $15 or $16 an hour at best. So for skilled servers at good restaurants, tips can be quite lucrative. They don't want to give that up. But here's the catch. That income is wildly inconsistent. One night you're making great money. The next week it's slow and you're barely scraping by. You can't plan, you can't budget reliably. It's stressful. From the business owner perspective, tipping is wonderful for them. It lets them keep prices on the menu lower, which attracts customers. People see a $15 burger and think that's reasonable, even though it's really going to cost them $18 or $19 with tip. And restaurant owners don't have huge payroll expenses. They're only paying servers $2 or $3 an hour. That's a massive savings. Their labor costs are shifted directly to customers. It's a great deal for them, not so great for workers or customers. So everyone has their reasons for either supporting or opposing the current system. That's why it's so hard to change. Let me give you some real numbers from my granddaughter's experience. She worked at a casual dining restaurant, not fancy but decent. Her base hourly wage was $2.50 an hour, basically nothing. Her paychecks were often literally zero after taxes were taken out. On a busy Friday night shift, she'd work maybe 6 hours. The restaurant would be packed. She'd be hustling, taking care of multiple tables, running around constantly. On a night like that, she might make $150 in tips. Add that to her $15 base pay for 6 hours, and she's making about $27 an hour. That's genuinely good money for a college student. But then, there'd be a slow Tuesday lunch shift. She'd work 5 hours, the restaurant would be half empty, and she might make $40 in tips. With her base pay, that's about $50 for 5 hours of work. That's $10 an hour before taxes. Barely above minimum wage. The inconsistency was really stressful for her. Some weeks, she'd make great money and think this job is worth it. Other weeks, she'd barely cover her expenses and wonder why she was working so hard for so little. And here's something people don't always realize. Being a server isn't just about carrying food. You're performing emotional labor constantly. You have to be cheerful, friendly, upbeat. Even when you're tired, even when your feet hurt, even when customers are rude or demanding. You have to smile and be pleasant because your income depends on it. You're being judged not just on whether you brought the food correctly, but on your personality, your appearance, your demeanor. That's exhausting. My granddaughter told me stories, customers who snapped their fingers at her, people who complained about things that weren't her fault and then penalized her by reducing the tip, tables that ran her ragged and then left $2 on a $60 bill. And you can't say anything. You can't defend yourself. You just have to smile and say, "Have a nice day," and hope the next table is better. Plus, there's real discrimination in tipping. This has been studied extensively. Women generally get tipped more than men. Attractive people, by conventional standards, get tipped significantly more than people considered less attractive. White servers often get tipped more than servers of color, even when providing identical service. Younger servers tend to do better than older ones. None of this is fair, but it's reality. Your income shouldn't depend on factors you can't control, like your appearance or race, but in the tipping system, It absolutely does. Now let's talk about tip creep, because this is what's really frustrating people in recent years. When I was young, tipping was pretty much limited to sit-down restaurants and maybe hairdressers or taxi drivers, places where someone was providing direct personal service over time. You didn't tip at fast food. You didn't tip when you picked up takeout. You didn't tip at a coffee counter where someone just poured you a cup. Now, it's everywhere. And I mean everywhere. You go to a coffee shop, you order a latte, the person makes it, which takes maybe 2 minutes, and hands it to you. The iPad payment screen spins around and shows you 3 buttons: 20%, 25%, 30%. And there's usually a custom option, but that feels stingy. And the worker is standing right there watching you decide. You ordered a $6 coffee. Now they're suggesting you add a $1.80 tip. For what? Making the drink is their job. That's what you're already paying for with the $6 price. But you feel guilty. Social pressure is real, so you probably hit 20% just to avoid feeling like a jerk. You order takeout from a restaurant. You're going to drive there yourself, pick it up yourself, take it home yourself. The restaurant did zero service beyond preparing the food you paid for. But there's still a tip line, and you feel like you should put something even though nobody served you. So you tip 15%, even though it makes no logical sense. Delivery apps are even worse. I tried ordering food delivery recently. The meal was $30. The app suggested a 25% tip, which is $7.50. But there was also a $5 delivery fee, and a $3 service fee, and a small order fee because I didn't order enough. By the time I was done, my $30 meal was going to cost me almost $50. I ended up just driving to get it myself. And here's what really bothers me. These apps and payment systems have made tipping more aggressive and manipulative. The suggested tip amounts have crept up. Used to be 15, 18, 20% options. Now it's 20, 25, 30. 25 is presented as the normal option, not the generous one. They're using psychology and social pressure to push tips higher and higher. And it's working. People are tipping more because they don't want to seem cheap or mean. I was at a self-serve frozen yogurt place with my grandkids recently. You walk in, grab a cup, fill it yourself from the machines, choose your own toppings, put it on a scale, and pay at a kiosk. You literally do everything yourself. The kiosk still asked for a tip. I just looked at it. Tip for what? Nobody did anything. There wasn't even a person at the register. It was completely self-service, but the tip screen was there anyway. 15, 20, 25% buttons staring at you. I hit no tip and felt ridiculous for feeling even slightly guilty about it. It's gotten absolutely ridiculous. But here's what I want people to understand, and this is important. This is not the worker's fault. The barista at the coffee shop didn't set up that tip screen. They probably hate that it's there because it creates awkward tension with customers. But their employer requires it. The delivery driver didn't decide what the suggested tip amounts should be. The app company did that. Companies are using tips as a way to shift their labor costs onto customers while avoiding the responsibility of paying fair wages. They're also using tips to hide the true cost of services. They can advertise lower prices because they know customers will add tips on top. It's deceptive pricing, and customers are getting fed up. I see it everywhere. People are talking about tip fatigue. They're tired of being asked to tip for everything. They're resentful. But if you don't tip, you're not hurting the company. The company already got paid. You're hurting the worker who's making $2 an hour and depending on those tips to survive. So we're stuck in this terrible system where everyone's frustrated, but nobody wants to change it because everyone has something to lose. Workers are afraid of losing the good money they make on busy nights. Business owners don't want to raise prices or increase payroll expenses. Customers are used to the system even though they don't like it. Some places have tried to fix this. Seattle is a good example. Washington State doesn't have a separate tipped minimum wage. Everyone, including servers, makes the full state minimum wage, which is over $15 an hour. Servers in Seattle still get tips on top of that, so they're making a living wage from their employer, and tips are truly extra. And you know what? Restaurants in Seattle didn't collapse. They adjusted prices upward a bit. Customers adjusted. Life went on. The sky didn't fall. California is similar. Servers make the full minimum wage, which is now $15.50 an hour statewide, higher in some cities. Plus, tips. It works fine. Some individual restaurants have tried even more radical changes. They've eliminated tipping entirely. They raised their menu prices by 20 or 25%, so the prices reflect the actual cost. They pay their staff a real salary with benefits. Some of these experiments have succeeded. Customers appreciate knowing exactly what they're paying. Workers appreciate stable, predictable income and benefits. But some have failed. Customers complained about the higher menu prices, even though they were paying the same amount they would have with tips. Servers sometimes left for places where they could make more on tips. It's been mixed results. We're so deeply conditioned to expect tip culture that changing it feels wrong, even when the change logically makes sense. Here's my perspective as someone who's been tipping for over 50 years, who's seen the system evolve, and who's talked to workers on both sides. I tip. I tip well. Usually 20%. More if service was exceptional, because I know that person depends on it. My granddaughter depends on it when she's working. I'm not going to stiff a server to make a political point about the system. When you don't tip, you're not hurting the restaurant owner or the system. You're hurting a worker who's probably struggling to pay rent. But I also think the system is fundamentally broken and unfair. Workers shouldn't have to depend on the generosity of strangers to earn a living wage. That's not how employment should work. An employer should pay their workers fairly. That's basic. Customers shouldn't have to subsidize business owners' payroll costs, and they shouldn't have to do mental math and navigate social pressure every time they buy something. The price should reflect the actual cost. Everyone should know what they're paying. Workers should earn a predictable living wage. That's how it works in most of the world, and it works fine. Other countries figured this out decades ago. In Japan, tipping is actually considered rude. It implies that the worker isn't being paid properly by their employer, which is insulting. Workers are paid fair wages. Prices include service. Everyone knows what they're paying. The system works. In most of Europe, service is included in the price. You might leave a small tip, maybe 5 or 10%, if service was truly exceptional and you want to show extra appreciation. But it's not expected or required. Workers earn a living wage from their employer. When I visited France with my wife years ago, we tried to leave a 20% tip at a restaurant. The server looked confused and tried to give it back. He said, "No, service is included." He was already being paid fairly. Our tip was unnecessary. That felt so much better. No math, no guessing, no social pressure. Just pay the price and go. Simple. How it should be. Why can't we do that here in America? Because change is hard. Because powerful lobbying groups, particularly the National Restaurant Association, fight hard to keep the current system. They like paying $2 an hour. They like having customers subsidize their labor costs. Because some servers, particularly at high-end restaurants, make very good money on tips and don't want to risk losing that income. Because customers, even though they complain, are conditioned to the system. Change feels uncomfortable even when it's better. Because we've built an entire culture around tipping, and culture is hard to change quickly. So we're stuck, at least for now. But I believe it will eventually change. The frustration is building. Younger people especially are questioning why we do things this way. More states are passing laws to raise tip minimum wages. The conversation is happening. Change is slow, but it happens. In the meantime, here's my advice to different groups. If you're an American customer, tip 20% for good service, 15% for adequate. More if someone went above and beyond. It's not the worker's fault the system is broken. They're just trying to survive. But also, support changes to the system. Support raising the minimum wage, including for tipped workers. Support ballot measures and legislation that would fix this. Patronize restaurants that pay fair wages and have eliminated tipping if you can find them. Vote with your wallet, but don't punish individual workers in the process. If you're visiting America from another country, I'm sorry. I know our tipping culture is confusing and probably seems ridiculous. Just remember that workers here literally depend on tips for survival. Budget an extra 20% on top of all menu prices and service costs, and you'll be fine. Yes, it's annoying. Yes, it seems backwards. But that's how the system works here, and workers need those tips to pay rent. If you're a worker in a tipped position, you deserve better. You deserve a living wage from your employer, not dependency on customer generosity. Support organizing efforts, support legislation, speak up when you can safely do so. But I also understand that you need to survive right now, and that tips are your income. Do what you need to do. If you're a business owner, pay your workers fairly. Yes, it might mean raising your prices, but customers will respect transparency and fairness, and workers who are paid fairly and treated well provide better service and stay longer. The race to the bottom doesn't help anyone in the long term. Is American tipping culture out of control? Yes, absolutely. Should it change? Yes, definitely. Will it change anytime soon? Probably not as fast as it should, but eventually I believe it will. The current system is unsustainable. Too many people are frustrated. Too many workers are struggling. Too much inequality and unfairness. Something will give eventually. But understanding why we're in this situation, understanding the history and the incentives and the perspectives of everyone involved, that's the first step to maybe fixing it someday. I'm Bob. That's the reality of tipping in America. It's complicated, it's frustrating, it's rooted in some pretty dark history, and it's not going away anytime soon. But I hope someday we can build a better system. One where workers are paid fairly by their employers, where customers know what they're actually paying, where social pressure and guilt don't determine someone's income. We can do better. We should do better. Until then, tip your servers well, support system change, and try to be kind to everyone who's just trying to make a living in a broken system. See you next time, folks.